Hello and welcome again to Microeconomics, where we're going to try to switch gears a little bit today. Today we begin a whole sequence of discussions about the resource market. We're really talking about the exact same sequence of exchanges, but we're looking at it from the other side now. And it's going to turn out that much of what we've done already is going to come back now. So much of what we're going to talk about in this section you've already seen before. In some cases we may extend it a little bit, but there should be a considerable carryover from earlier material into this. In fact, we're actually even going to use some of the same examples again to sort of remind us of where we are. So I would say that probably 50 to 75% of this is actually review, but then we'll extend it a little bit. So let's talk for a moment about what we've had to say about resources and some of the things that we've learned about resources. First off, one of the things that we need to remember is that we as households are resource suppliers, and that on this side of the market, since it's a resource market, the demanders are actually the firms. The firms demand the resources, and we've said all along that firms are interested in buying resources as long as what they get for it is greater than what it costs them. So in this case, rather than looking at the product side, we're actually going to look at the resource side, and the same sort of principles apply. That is, they're interested in having marginal revenue be greater than marginal cost, or the cost or the return for the resource greater than the cost of the resource. So they're interested in maximizing profit. On the other hand, we're interested in supplying them with the resources, assuming that that maximizes our utility. Now, we as suppliers are willing to move the resources to its highest paying alternative. And much of what we'll see when we talk next time about labor and what happens in the labor market is related to what happens in terms of flowing those resources from one use to another use in order to increase the income that's associated with it. Remember that essentially what we have is a wage rate. Much what we're going to talk about this time is actually couched in terms of labor. The same sort of principles apply no matter what the resource is, but it's easier if we think of it in terms of labor because that's something that we can all identify with. In the market, there is a demand and there is a supply of the resource, and that leads to an equilibrium wage, and an equilibrium quantity. And once again, if it were a different resource, we could just talk about prices rather than wages, where wage is just a special case of a price. So, one of the first things that we need to identify or recognize is that the resource demand is actually derived from the demand for the final good or service. One way of thinking of this is to think in terms of the firm being a sort of a black box, and on one side the resources come in and on the other side the product goes out. If we think of it in that terms, the way that we have been considering before is what happens on the right side of that is where the product is going out. But another way of thinking of it is what happens on the left side, and that is where the resource is going in. The demand is actually the sum of all the demands for the resource. Most resources actually have multiple uses. That is, they're useful for more than one different thing. So if you think of a laborer as an example, he could actually be useful as a carpenter, or he could be useful as some other construction trade, or in the moving industry, or in a number of different industries. So it's in fact the case that most resources actually have multiple uses. So when we think about the market demand for that resource, we're thinking about the demand in all its alternative uses, all of which are downward sloping. That is, we're willing to use more, or firms are willing to use more if the price drops. And since that's the case in each of the alternative uses, when we sum them all together or add them all together, then we have a downward sloping demand curve as well. So remember that when we define demand, we always say prices and alternative quantities demanded, all other things equal. And we often talk about the willingness to purchase and the ability to purchase. Why is it that producers are willing to purchase or have a greater ability to purchase? Or, alternatively, what would cause a producer to be more willing to buy a resource or have a greater ability to buy resources? Well, obviously, producers would be more willing to buy if the price is relatively cheaper. That is, if we have more workers available and their price goes down, then obviously we would be more willing to buy them. On the other hand, they're also more willing to buy the resource if we can use it as a substitute in production, if it is relatively cheaper in comparison to other means of production. And this oftentimes happens in times when we have surplus of labor, we have lots of extra laborers around, then we begin to see people being used without very much in the way of capital equipment, and we simply substitute labor for capital. They also have a greater ability to buy because since the individual prices are lower, then they can hire more for the exact same total cost. And presumably each and every one of them brings some product with them, and so as a result, they're willing to hire more labor. Here's a case example of that in which we remember that their demand is actually derived from the demand for the final good or service. If we look at what's happened to the price of lumber, along about 2001, we began to see an increase in demand for housing. The result was an increase in the demand for lumber. And so we see lumber prices rise by about 68% between 2001 and 2004. Then along about 2005, we began to see a decline in housing demand. So we began to see the price of lumber drop between 2005 and 2007. And again, the demand for the resource was derived from the demand for the final good or service. And so as a result, we began to see a drop-off in the demand and ultimately in the prices for the underlying resource. So the moral of this story is if you want to go to work in an industry, make sure you go to work in an industry where there's lots of demand for the product because that determines your value as well. On the supply side, the market supply is the sum of all individual supply curves. And since each one of those is upward sloping, then the combination of that's going to be upward sloping as well, which simply says that as the price rises, the suppliers are going to be more willing and more able to sell the resource. So as you could think of this in terms of wages, as the wage rate goes up, you're more willing to sell because it would give you higher earnings. And earnings in and of itself is not what you're really after. What you're really after is the goods and services that you could purchase with those earnings. It also is the case that you're more able to supply a greater quantity at higher earnings. It becomes worth your while to undergo any sort of training or any sort of education or any of those sorts of things which would make you available or more attractive as a resource. So as the price rises, it not only elicits an additional quantity of output of existing suppliers, but it also entices new suppliers into the market in order to maximize their utility and take advantage of the higher value of those services. Now, it's important for us to recognize that resources flow to their highest valued use. We make the assumption in our economy that they're freely mobile. That is, they're able to adjust from one place to another place until ultimately we end up with roughly the same value, the same payment, no matter where they're employed. And we do this by adjusting the markets and reallocating the resources from one area to the other. And let's look at an example of that. Here we have two different uses for carpenters. In one case, in panel A, carpenters that are working on home building are making $25 an hour, and tend to supply 58,000 hours of labor, 58,000 hours of labor per day. On the right-hand side in panel B, you see that furniture makers, on the other hand, are making $20 per hour, and they're supplying roughly 12,000 hours of labor per day. Now, what will happen as a result of this? Well, obviously, furniture makers aren't incapable of seeing the prices that are being paid in the home builder market. So what will ultimately happen is some of the people who are making furniture will shift their production away from furniture making and shift their production to home building. The result of that is the supply curve will decrease for furniture making, driving the price per hour up to $24 per hour and reducing the quantity available from 12,000 hours of labor per day to 10,000 hours of labor per day. That will also increase the supply of home building carpenters and lower their price from $25 to $24, and we'll move from 58,000 hours per day of labor supplied to 60,000 hours per day of labor supplied. And this is an example of the resource moving from one market to another market, from one use to an alternative use, in which we ultimately end up with the price of the resource being the same in both alternative uses, and the resource, in this case labor, simply moves from one to the other. Now, it is the case that sometimes we observe that there are differences in resource pay, and they tend to sustain themselves. We can't do anything about them. And that happens oftentimes for a number of different reasons. The first and most likely case is the case of lack of resource mobility. We made the assumption in our example that carpenters could simply move from one to the other. There are some resources that simply can't move from one to the other. As an example, there's plenty of cheap land in Utah, and yet land is very expensive and very scarce in Manhattan. But it's impossible to move the cheap land from Utah to Manhattan, and so we have a lack of resource mobility. And so as a result of that, the price differential will be maintained between Manhattan land and Utah land. It's also the case that in some cases, resources have an inherent quality which is not duplicatable. One of the assumptions we made with our carpenters was that anyone who was capable of making furniture could also make houses. That probably is true in that case, but it is the case that sometimes certain training levels are not proper for different uses, for things that you would think normally would be able to. There are various different classes of carpenters, as an example. There are various different classes of electricians, various different classes of plumbers. Not to say that it's not possible for them to shift from one to the other, but it sometimes takes an additional training or takes some mobility that may not necessarily be there. And that leads us to the time and money involved in developing the necessary skills. It may not be worth your while to retrain and develop a new skill set, which makes it possible for you to be a little bit more mobile. It's also the case that sometimes we see permanent differences in the price paid for resources due to non-monetary aspects of the job. If the job is particularly dangerous, or if the job happens at a time that's not particularly appealing. Typically, shift workers make more for late night shifts than they do for daytime shifts, as an example. Or if the job is illegal, or if the job has some other non-monetary aspect, there may be a permanent differential that's paid for the resource in order to attract that resource. And those will persist for long periods, and there's really not much you can do about it. The result of that is that we see a combination, when we look at resources, of both opportunity cost and economic rent. Now, we've encountered opportunity cost before, and that is, what is the resource's best alternative use? The one that we haven't encountered before is economic rent. And economic rent is simply any earning in excess of the opportunity cost, or as some people would refer to it, pure gravy. The less elastic the resource is, the greater the economic rent. So let's see if we can think of an example of this. If you look at the earnings profile of Shaquille O'Neal, you see that he makes about $30,000 a year playing basketball and with endorsements. How much of that is opportunity cost and how much of it's economic rent? Well, surprisingly, Shaquille O'Neal is also a rap star. And Shaquille O'Neal has 6 or 8 rap albums, and from those he makes about $1 million per year. So his next best alternative to being a basketball player is to be a rap star, and so his opportunity cost is $1 million per year. So $1 million per year is the opportunity cost, and the other $29 million is economic rent. It's earnings over and above the opportunity cost. In his case, he has a fairly inelastic resource supply curve because there's only one of them, and so as a result, he enjoys a lot of economic rent. If he were perfectly inelastic, that is, there's absolutely no substitute whatsoever, no alternative use for him whatsoever, and no one who could substitute for him whatsoever, then all of his earnings would be economic rent. If, on the other hand, he simply earns his opportunity cost, that is, if he were only earning $1 million per year playing basketball, then it would all be opportunity cost and there would be no economic rent whatsoever. Let's see what that looks like graphically. Graphically, here we have 3 potential possibilities. In panel A, all of the earnings here are economic rent. This is our property in Utah. The property in Utah, so many millions of acres per month. The alternative to using it is not using it. So whatever you get is all economic rent. And in fact, if you think about it, that's exactly the terminology that we typically would use. If you were to want to have use of some of that land, you would refer to that as rent. And so it's entirely economic rent. In panel B, we have day laborers. Day laborers could be working in the yard, they could be working at some work site somewhere, they could be working in a factory, whatever. They're completely unskilled workers. Their opportunity cost is $10 and what they're paid is $10. So they're going to make $10 per hour whether they work at the work site, work in a plant somewhere, work in your backyard, whatever they might do, they draw the exact same amount of money. The result is they're paid nothing above their opportunity cost, and so their entire earnings are opportunity cost. Now, for most of us, we are very similar to what's in panel C there, where we do have an alternative. That is, there is an opportunity cost, but we typically make something greater than the opportunity cost. That is, in this case, the difference between $7 per hour and $14 per hour is all economic rent. It's the difference between our opportunity cost of $7 per hour and what we're actually paid at $14 per hour. And that may be due to any of a number of things. That's exactly the theory behind why people make more money as they stay in a location for longer periods of time, because they understand how to do it better, they understand how the organization runs, they've got some sort of inside advantage over someone that just walked in off the street. Now, when we think about this from the firm side, I want to remind you of a couple of things that we talked about before, and that is the quantity of the resource that we're interested in employing depends crucially on what that resource brings us. And if you'll think back to our discussion of that before, we said that if you define the total product that's produced, what we're interested in seeing is how much does that change for an additional unit of the resource. So as we move from one resource level to the next resource level, we could define our marginal product, which is simply the change in the total product. How much does total product change when we change the level of the resource? And remember that we discovered that we enjoy is probably not good terminology, but we exhibit diminishing marginal returns. That is, the marginal product, at least eventually, will decline. Now, that's a good concept, but the problem with that is that it has no dollars and cents attached to it. So an alternative way of looking at it is in a dollar and cents form, and there we would be interested in the marginal revenue product. And the marginal revenue product could be thought of in two different ways. One is the change in total revenue that we get as a result of changing the level of resource used. So we simply look at how much did total revenue change as we employed this additional person. So if we're thinking of adding a clerk and the clerk is going to add $500 of sales to our sales and they cost $400, then we would be interested in that clerk because they add $500 and they cost us $400. So that would be a profit maximizing decision to hire that clerk. The other way of thinking of it is to go back to the concept of marginal product. That is, we could take the marginal product and multiply it times the price, and we should end up with the same identical number either way we did it. We could do it either of those two different ways. We could look at the change in total revenue, or we could look at the change in product and multiply that times the price. Now here we once again encounter the concept that we have just talked about in the last few sessions. And that is that that's going to then depend critically on what the status of the product market is. In the case of a perfectly competitive product market, the marginal revenue product curve is going to slope downwards due to the diminishing marginal returns of the resource. That is, if we look at our calculation there, marginal product times price, we know that marginal product is going to decline as we add more and more resources. Price remains the same, but the overall number is going to go down because the marginal product is going down. In the case of markets in which the producer has some control over the price, however, remember that as we sell more and more units of output, as we produce more and more product, we have to lower the price in order to sell it. So in that case, looking at our calculation there, the marginal product will be falling, but the price will be falling as well. And so this gives us but another reason why it's the case that in markets where there is some market power in the product market, that is, we're selling as a pure monopolist or monopolistically competitive or an oligopoly market, in those cases we're going to employ less resources because we're going to want to produce less product. So back to our example, you may identify with these numbers. We looked at these one time before. This was a case in which we were running a business where we were actually moving furniture for people, and we were considering how many workers per day do we want to employ. And remember, as we increased the number of workers, the total amount of tonnage that we could move in a particular day increased. So you can see as we go from 0 workers to 1 workers, we go from 0 total output to 10 total output. As we go from 1 to 2, we go from 10 to 9, and that's what's in column 3. It's the additional tonnage that that worker brought us. In this case, since workers are incrementing in one unit increments, then we simply can take the difference between the two numbers in the total product column. So we can see that as we move from 2 workers to 3 workers, the additional third worker adds 8 tons of additional product. In column 4, we see that this must be a perfectly competitive market because the product price is the same. We charge the people who are buying the moving service from us $20 per ton. And so in column 5, we have the total revenue as a result of various different levels of workers. And so you see if we have one worker, we have total revenue of $200. If we have two workers, we have total revenue of $380. Three workers, $540, and so forth. Now we could get the marginal revenue product, and what we're attempting to get in column 6 is what does each additional worker bring to us in terms of how much of change in revenue? Because we're going to compare that with what they cost us and decide how many to employ. Remember that looking at column 3, we see the diminishing marginal returns. That is, each additional worker does not add as much as his predecessors did. To get to column 6, we could either take the difference between the two numbers in column 5. That is, as we move from one worker to two, it goes from $200 to $380, which gives us $180. As we go from 2 to 3, it goes from $380 to $540, which means the third worker adds $160 to our revenues. Or we could take the marginal product, that is the number in column 3, and multiply it times the price. And so you see as we go from 6 workers to 7 workers, the 7th worker adds 4 units, 4 tons times $20, which will give us $80, which is what you see on 6. So you can do that one of two different ways. You can either take the difference in the total revenue, or you can take the marginal product and multiply it times the price, either of which will give you the same number. Now once again, what we would do with column 6 is compare it to what it's going to cost us to hire a worker, and it should determine for us how many workers we want to hire. Now how does that change when we have a non-competitive environment? That is, suppose this was a monopolistically competitive market or an oligopoly market. Well, what changes is column 3 here. You can see in column 3 that as we sell more and more product, we have to lower the price of the product. So the number in column 5, the marginal revenue product number, is going to fall more quickly. It falls because we're missing a marginal product column, but it's the same numbers as what we had before. If you'll recall, before we had the marginal product column, and it began to decline immediately. So that number is going down, and the product price number is going down. So as a result, this falls off twice as quickly. Exactly the same thing we saw on the product side. When we're looking at the product market side of this, we noticed that marginal revenue fell off more quickly. Well, the same thing's happening here. So the moral of this story is that if you're in a market where the seller, the firm, in that product market has some market power, they're not going to employ as many people as they would if they were perfectly competitive. Now we want to compare that with the marginal resource cost, which is the change in total cost from hiring one additional laborer in this case. And since they're all being hired at the exact same market wage or the total cost of their service, will maximize profit where the marginal revenue cost is equal to the marginal revenue product. So from the market side, there is a price determined. That then determines the resource supply. From the firm side, they're actually pure, they see a resource market that's perfectly competitive from their standpoint, and so they compare that wage rate with what their demand is. And so in this case, since it costs $100 per day to hire workers, then they'll hire 6 workers because that's the point at which the worker is worth what they're having to pay. And the accompanying golden rule, remember the golden rule on the product side was marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Well, it's very similar on this side. The golden rule for maximizing profits is to hire to where a resource is equal to marginal revenue product is equal to marginal resource cost. So that's the equivalent on the resource side of the marginal revenue, marginal cost on the other side. So what sorts of things might change this demand? We've been assuming that the marginal revenue product or the demand curve remains the same no matter what. Well, the most important things that would change is either some sort of a change in the substitutes or complements of this resource or some sort of a technological change. If the cost of a machine to pick up the boxes rather than hiring someone was to drop drastically, then it might be, we might substitute that machine for the workers, and thus we would demand less of the workers even though their price hasn't changed. On the other hand, there might be some resources that are complementary. We might have a necessity to have trucks for the worker, and if the price of the trucks for the worker were to go up, then that would lower our demand for the workers no matter what happened to their pricing. Likewise, technology may mean that a change in technology makes the worker relatively more expensive or relatively less expensive. It may be that technology suddenly arises that means that this worker, employing this worker may not be necessary anymore. But remember that this is always a derived demand, so any change in the product's price is going to change the demand for the product, for the resource. Because remember that the marginal revenue product is actually the product of what you produce, the number of units you produce, times the price of those. So if the price of those drops, then it means you are relatively worth less than you were before, although your production levels haven't changed any at all. From the firm standpoint, you're not worth as much to them anymore. And so any changes in the product's price change the demand for the underlying resource since it's a derived demand. A little debate that took place several years ago, kind of an interesting debate. May 2007, the minimum wage was to be raised to $7.25. Only 4% of the workers actually earned less than that. So one of the ongoing debates that we have each and every time we start considering a minimum wage is, does this help or is this not helpful? On the positive side, advocates would point to the fact that it actually increases the income of the poorest workers and that perhaps it's worthwhile to try to help out the 4% of the workers who actually earn less than that. On the other hand, critics would charge that what will happen then is that employers will cut all of the non-wage compensation, health benefits, life insurance, all of those sort of things, and that they will also scale back employment. In fact, these arguments were actually made in Congress as they were considering this. So higher minimum wage from the employer's standpoint could cause them to substitute part-time for full-time workers, substitute more qualified for less qualified workers, and adjust the non-wage components. However, one interesting little side note of what happens as a result of this, it makes the opportunity cost of staying in school higher, and so as a result, it actually does have impacts on whether people stay in school or not. Well, next time we're going to talk a little bit more. I know we've talked an awful lot this time about labor, and I used labor as an example of a resource in talking about resource markets in general. Next time we're going to talk more explicitly about labor, and in fact we're going to talk entirely about labor and some of the impacts that we see in the labor market. And then we'll move on to some other resources in later sessions after that. That's all for this time. See you next time.